Wisconsin, which is now a destination area for people all over the Midwest, has received, and that's probably conservative, hundreds of millions of dollars of input in the last 50, 60, 70 years for stream restoration. It's a major area. It's a kind of a showcase for the state and the DNR and Trout Unlimited, which is the major funder of a lot of that work in terms of what they can do. But what I'm going to tell you is that there's a lot of competing interests in terms of what restoration means, so it's not without some controversy. And now efforts are starting to shift into the central part of Wisconsin and eventually into the northern part of the state, and how we kind of juxtapose different interests. Good fishing versus good habitat restoration aren't always the same thing. And that's kind of what this project led me to. So a little bit about the trout streams in the state. This is an old map, it's still pretty accurate, that shows the distribution of trout streams in Wisconsin. They have to be fairly cold water, so the oxygen content of the water is high enough for trout to survive. When water gets too warm and the oxygen content of the water goes down, trout basically suffocate. They don't fry to death in warm water, but they suffocate. That's primarily what's happening. So the southwest in the driftless area is this set of streams, which is considered kind of a showpiece nowadays in the upper Midwest. But in terms of other streams, one of the largest concentrations is in the northeast, and this includes a lot of federal land, including the Nicolet National Forest. So a little bit about the driftless area, super quick. I could talk about this for a couple of hours. But the driftless area, where those streams are, is basically the southwestern part of Wisconsin, which has some of the most rugged landscape in the state, some of the most beautiful area in the state. There's lots of springs because of the geology, and it remained unglaciated during the last ice age and previous ones. And so we have this really picturesque landscape, deep valleys, deep groundwater flow, very cold water that's feeding these hundreds and hundreds of trout streams. And I said it was kind of a landscape model for restoration today. This is a typical photo that you see in tourist brochures for the driftless area. The idea that it's kind of this bucolic landscape with little farms, people farming in harmony with nature. This is called contour farming to kind of inhibit soil erosion. Forested slopes to try to reduce erosion as well. And then in the valleys, you have these spring cold-fed streams. And the estimate, probably a little high, is about $1 billion of the total impact economically of sport fishing in the state. About $1 billion of that is concentrated in the southwestern part of the state, plus or minus. I think it's a little small. Dave agrees with me on that. Here's where this region started in the 1930s. So it's kind of an area that people would consider kind of a complete cycle of natural settlement, environmental destruction, and restoration. Kind of a complete circle or cycle of landscape restoration. The southwestern part was settled much like some other parts of southern Wisconsin, mostly by Euro-American settlers from about 1840, 1850, 1860. And one of the things that happened is the combination of the geology, where they had really erodible sediments in the landscape called glossets of fine-grained silt, coupled with basically people who were trying to take everything they could off the landscape to use. Every piece of wood would go into fencing or building houses and farms, things like that. Heating wood, for example, in buildings was taken off. And it resulted in a tremendous amount of soil erosion. And literally this was a trout stream at one time before in these valleys. Where did all this sediment go? Because this is kind of up the valley, right? This is near the valley tops where I showed you that beautiful farm today sitting in the landscape. It didn't go all the way to places like the Mississippi or the Wisconsin River. It just wound up going down the valley a few miles and then getting stuck there. And it's still there. And so today, some trout streams that have not had restoration look something like this. There are trout in here, but it's nothing like it would have been, say, prior to settlement. And the problem is that usually when you look at the landscape from here to here, is the sediment that came from several miles upstream, starting in the 1840s and 1850s, up until about the 1930s when conservation efforts really picked up. So that's kind of the first part. The restoration part is great to some people. To scientists, it's not so much a restorative work as it is an engineering type of work. And the long-term implications are the ones that are problematic. A few years ago, Becky, who's here, and I took some students to the Southwest, and we had a tour by the guy from Trout Unlimited, major funder of restoration work. They pump over $10 million a year into stream restoration, and this was one of his pride and joy projects that were going on. Basically what they would do is that sediment that I showed you that was making those high banks, creating all kinds of issues, especially during floods, like covering gravel that was used for trout reproduction. They were cutting back with heavy machinery and then bringing it in riprap, kind of like what we have along the edge of campus, riprapping the sides of the channels and then growing grass back on top of it. And so eventually the stream would look like this. And again, this is a national model. Not only to people in the Midwest, all over the country. Trout Unlimited writes about it as Here's, without going into all the reasons why it's problematic from a scientific standpoint, here's, I think, a way to think about it. This is the driftless area. Is it more like this, or is it more like this? And it's a slide that I use sometimes with my students. This stream, even though it has been restored, has the nearshore areas restored as wetlands, which is probably a lot more like the natural streams were 200 years ago. And so what happens when the river floods is it rises, but pretty quickly the water can spread into the wetlands. The flow is slowed down by the wetlands. There's a limited amount of erosion, but in addition, the stream can still do what it naturally does, which is move back and forth across the valley, which is actually an integral part of, it's kind of its very being, its ability to move sediment down the river system. This river has become this. And I didn't know this, but these are called lazy rivers. Carla, did you know that?
I've been in several.
When I was in the Tundra Lodge in the lazy river, I didn't know it was called a lazy river, but it makes perfect sense. This stream on the left is really a lot more like the one on the right than the one on the bottom. The short-term benefits are huge. Usually within a couple of years, the 50 to 60 plus year old bad knees Trout Unlimited donors think this is spectacular. It's like fishing in a park. They took all the trees out. They sloped the grass. There's no steep banks anymore. The long-term implications are almost certainly bad. And invariably, trout stream biologists, fisheries people, geomorphologists who look at these projects long-term, and long-term might only be 10 to 20 years, almost invariably that kind of work fails for lots of different reasons, in multiple ways. But this is, again, kind of considered the showcase. And it's an area that's gone through a complete cycle of, before settlement, environmental issues, and then restoration. And now the issue will be, how long is that going to work in that kind of model, for the time being, because that's largely how it's done. So, how are people thinking about this from a scientific perspective? There's a couple of women. Ellen Wohl, she's a woman that teaches as geomorphologist at Colorado State, and Dorothy Maritz, who's a woman in one of the East Coast schools, who've done a lot of work on trying to understand what rivers were really like naturally before we settled here and began really changing them. And in addition, have started to really try to argue more forcefully that we need to have a different approach to river restoration, and that restoration should ultimately be designed to facilitate what's called natural river forming process. That means restore the river so it actually works like it did originally. And the only way that you're going to do that is to start off you have to know how we changed them in the past. And that's one of the things in the Southwest that's sort of known but not completely known. And so a lot of the work that was done there skipped ahead of that stage to know what were those rivers really like before settlement and how much did we really change them in detail. And so the ultimate goal that they say is to give a river resilience. And what that means is when something bad happens to it, major floods, it can restore itself. Meaning you don't have to bring out the heavy machinery again and dump the riprap into the banks. Does that make sense? And as part of that, this idea of knowing human activities is to answer the question, what was before, being Euro-American settlement in particular, how is that maybe still present in some way? So is there a legacy effect, basically, of things that happened in Wisconsin that would have been, say, in the mid-1800s to the late 1800s, to about 1900. So originally, am I doing on time? Let me check. Originally, my idea was I'm going to write about the Southwest. But the Southwest is a story that's kind of already known, for the most part. And then I realized when I started to thinking about comparing it with the northern wood streams that this was neater for lots of reasons. But one is that it hasn't really gone through a complete cycle of restoration. Pretty baby. I'm glad you brought it. So basically, it hasn't gone through one of these complete cycles of restoration. The restoration has been different. Let the forest come back, basically, but not really focus on the streams. But what's coming up fairly soon is there's a new fisheries director from the DNR now in Shawano. And as you might expect, as soon as he was put in place 2 years ago, the first people knocking on his door was Trout Unlimited, because they had the pocketbooks. And they were basically saying, when are you going to start initiating projects on this, and this river so we can give you money to do it, because they're not really good trout streams. And one of the questions that he has, and he's a real forward-thinking trout fisheries biologist, is, I don't even know what they were like before. Maybe we should find that out first, and maybe some of the restoration that they think we want to do is really not the way we should be doing it anymore. And so he kind of drove me with some conversations to think more about the Northwoods, and I decided to go back and look a little bit at the Nicolet, which is actually not his area. It's federally controlled, but it's kind of a nice study area because there's a little more history for some of that region, and some additional kind of new tech stuff that's pretty cool. So a little bit about the Northwoods. The impact in terms of settlement is different. The Southwest was mostly conversion to agriculture, and it was in a landscape that was a mixture of prairie and trees, forest, so it was called oak savanna. In northern Wisconsin, even though this upper map from the early 1600s shows forest everywhere, the Northwoods were thought to be continuous forests, and in particular with the prime species being big white pines, primarily. So what happened in the Northwoods was a little bit earlier than 1850, so Wisconsin becomes a state in 1848. Settlers are really starting to move in the 1840s to 1870s and 80s in kind of big waves. Before that, people were doing the same thing that was going to happen to Wisconsin here in New England. And they were already working in the mid-continent here. Those same groups of people were moving into Wisconsin then to log, take lumber. And actually, from 1850 to 1920, so this is a span of just 70 years, we lost almost all of the eastern forests. Anything that's there now was either protected, but usually just in small areas, and that has made a comeback in particular. This deforestation rate has been calculated to be about the same as some of the tropical deforestation rates that we see today. And so when the US says to Brazil, listen, you guys need to slow down, you're going to ruin the planet. We did the same thing 100 years ago, the whole way through. But they don't know that. I don't think. We don't mention that. Our deforestation rates in terms of acres per year, for example, actually matches closely what is happening elsewhere around the world. So, just real quickly, where was all that wood going when people finally moved into this area, 1850 to 1870, 1880? The bigger and darker the dots are represents where major logging took place. Lower Michigan, along the major rivers in western Wisconsin, and then the Northeast was a big deal, in part because we had a couple of big rivers. The Menominee and the Oconto were two major rivers to take wood out because early on there were no roads and there were no railroads, so the major way of getting wood out was by floating it down rivers to lumbering towns like Oconto, which was actually much more important than Green Bay was, and Marinette, Menominee. Those were three of the major towns that served as lumber towns. Any ideas where all this wood went?
Chicago.
It went right here. Yeah. It would arrive at those port towns, those lumber towns, get sawn up into wood, and then countless boats would make their way either across the lake or down the eastern shore of Wisconsin to Chicago, which had huge lumber yards. And basically, Wisconsin wood built part of Chicago. But Chicago was also the distribution center for wood to people that were settling the plains that needed wood to build houses, put fencing for farms, because there weren't very many trees on the plains to begin with. But it all went to Chicago for the most part. So that's where it was going. There were three kind of phases of logging. This is the one that interested me the most. There was a later railroad phase, which actually ties into that picture I showed you. And then we have a phase that still comes up to the present, which is basically lumber trucks, right? Logging trucks that take logs out of the woods. But from about 1860 to 1890 was the prime white pine phase. There were no railroads yet in northeast Wisconsin, and so streams were the primary mode of log transport, but the only thing you could put down a stream was pine, because pine is light. It's less dense than water, so it would float. When all the pine was taken out, you had to shift to something else like rail, because all the hardwoods are denser than water and would sink. And so it's primarily during this white pine phase that we used rivers. So even though that phase ended over 100 years ago, it's going to be that 30, 40-year interval that is the one that had the major impact on streams, because then everybody left them to use rail, and then eventually roads and trucks. If you've never seen slides of what northern Wisconsin looks like, late 1800s, this is really typical. Hardly a tree standing in places where pines were dominant. This is actually a river. This is the Clam River with a logging crew standing on top of their work. White pine, in some cases, got 5 to 6 to 7 feet across. And so typically what would happen is logging would take place in the winter time because all the wetlands were frozen, and you could make horses drag all the logs out and put them next to the river. And when the first big flood of spring started up, you rolled the logs in and let them float down. And that's typically how things work. There was a problem though, and the problem was that if you were logging, in these streams, they were pretty small. And in some cases, just a few feet wide. And even in the spring flood, they didn't have enough flow to put a lot of logs into. And so what the loggers did was, and the lumber companies, is they said, well, for example, let's imagine that this is the Menominee River, and these are all the small tributaries. They put in dams on the upper parts of the small tributaries called splash dams. And a splash dam would look something like this. This is a photo from Upper Michigan. We don't have photos from that time in Wisconsin, but they probably look like this. Here's a guy for scale. So they would put in these dams that were maybe 10 to 12 feet tall, at a central gate that could be opened all at once. And they would let water periodically pond behind the dam, put the logs into it, and then generate an artificial flood. And they would do this countless times every summer. So they weren't just needing to use the spring flood from the snow melt, they could make as many floods as they wanted. And just think of the first implication of that stream that this flood is coming into, which normally might experience a flow like that once per year in the spring, now experienced countless numbers of those kinds of floods every single year. The channel has to change. And typically what people would see, for example, in the Northwest, where they could measure it, because it still was going on in the 40s and 50s and 60s, 1940s, 50s, and 60s, is that channels would get really wide because they would get scoured by the logs. They would eventually silt in and get kind of shallow in places. And even many decades later, when lumbering and logging were long gone, you still had the shapes of those old channels, and they hadn't readjusted to modern conditions yet. And they present all kinds of issues in terms of fairly bad habitat for fish, relatively monotonous, flat, shallow channels. So here's kind of a cool thing. Here's a whole lumber company receipt for putting dams on the McCaslin Brook, which is a stream that I've been poking around with some students looking at stuff because there's a little bit of detail for it. So it's hard to read, but these were the names of the dams that were going to be put in and the cost to build each one of them. So there was Reservoir, Wheeler, Archibald, Sheridan, and Lynn's. And then it says cleaning out the stream, $1,000, $1,100. It wasn't just the building of the dams and the floods that changed the streams. It was, and by the way, those are typical log jams on small streams in the Pacific Northwest. The other issue was that to prepare the stream so you would not get jams like this, guys would go up the streams before the dams were built and dynamite out the rocks. And they would drag all the wood out that had accumulated in there for hundreds of years, if not longer, that were good natural habitat for fish, for trout. They became kind of sterile channels in a sense. And so you might think, well, the goal is, you might think, well, what did it look like in the past? This might be something that's remotely close to what it was before we started working in the logging industry in northeast Wisconsin. This is in Wisconsin, and it's on the Menominee Indian Reservation. And the interesting thing about the Menominee is that they've used for over 100 years a much more holistic logging and harvesting methodology than we've used almost any place else in the state. And basically, any wood that falls into the stream, they let fall into the stream. They don't clean it out, they don't do anything to it. They don't harvest wood that's relatively close to rivers, and the channels on their reservation today look starkly different than the very same streams even upstream outside of the reservation that were logged in the 1850s to 1890s. So kind of the question became, when I started working on this project, well, I'm not just going to write history, but then I realized that actually there's all kinds of projects in looking at the legacy of logging impacts on streams in northeast Wisconsin. There's a few things you can look at. The remains are obvious. Those are the dams. Those are the things that are still there. But it's actually what's not there that might be more important. The big wood is gone that was in the stream. The big rocks are gone. The sand and gravel that's important for spawning in many places is gone. The native vegetation is certainly gone as well. So the very tree species that would get so big are no longer there. They're replaced by smaller pulpwood. And one of the ways, or the ways of trying to get at that, was to look at history. The descriptions of loggers and lumbermen, as imperfect as they are, and then the handout I gave you is an interesting find about St. Norbert, connected to St. Norbert from a poet, and then also starting to use some new technology. So if I've got time, I'll show you a little bit about the technology and how things have changed. You know what this is? Recognize it? It's St. Norbert. Yeah. Here's Main Hall. Here's student center, right, down by the water. The docks are right here, sticking out. The atrium, right, the outdoor area is right there, and so on. The quad up here, Michael's Center is right there, Michael's Common, and this is the river. For over 100 years, the way that geologists or anybody else who wanted to study the shape of the Earth's surface looked at it was using what were called topographic maps. And topo maps were made using aerial photos and kind of a funny system of basically looking at aerial photos with a device that basically made it look like you were seeing things in 3D. And then you'd have surveyed points here and there where you had known elevations, and you kind of drew lines that said, this line on the ground is 100 feet above sea level. But some of the things that we want to look at, and people have wanted to look at for decades, you can't use that information for. It's just not good enough. It's not giving you enough detail. And one of the technologies that developed just in the last couple of decades is a technology that greatly increases our ability to know the shape of the Earth's surface, and it's transforming things in lots of ways. So this is St. Norbert, but it's St. Norbert represented by dots, right? You can probably make that out. There's millions of them just in this area. And what happened was, an airplane was flown over the ground shooting a laser out of it, and about every 3 to 5 feet, the laser would go back up to the airplane. And the airplane is controlled by a really sensitive GPS. And by doing a lot of fancy computer work that those kinds of people do, it's converted basically into what's called a point cloud. So this is literally like a cloud of dots that bounced off of anything that the laser hit as it was flying over the ground. And if you turn it like this now, here's the docks. Can you see those? Main hall is here. And you see the trees? Kind of the red. And then notice that, the buildings are represented by black with no dots. What's hard to see is that the dots that you were seeing in the last perspective were the lasers bouncing off of the roofs, right? And then the ground next to the building, they're bouncing off of the trees. So what you can do is you can take those images and you can also color them. This is just the same view in color now, so you can kind of make out the walkways and the buildings. And you can say, take away any point that's not the ground. Wipe that out of the file. And then take any points that are next to each other and connect them by a surface. And what you wind up with is basically an image of what the ground looks like with accuracy of a few inches and a density of points that's only about 3 to 5 feet. This doesn't look particularly useful to study St. Norbert, right? These are the places where the buildings were. They're just represented by those flat areas. But here's what you can do that's so cool is you can see through forests. And some of you might have been looking in the news recently where in Honduras, they found these old, incredibly complex old villages, archaeological sites. No one knew where they were there. They flew over the ground with one of those laser-equipped airplanes. They said, take away all the dots that are hitting trees versus the ones that are hitting the ground, and make me a map that shows the surface of the ground. This is not Honduras, this is New England, it's Connecticut. And these are old farmstead lines in this forest where nobody's living anymore in their 18th century. And so that's just one application of that kind of technique. So what are we doing now here with a few students? This is northern Wisconsin, and this is McCaslin Brook. It's right through here. And the dam, one of the dams used to be here, and it dammed water in this kind of low flat area to the north. So we just recently, because the county had gotten this with some help from our person on campus who's teaching a GIS course for us, processed the points in the file and said, take away everything except the ground. Show me what the ground looks like below the trees. And basically what you're looking at is the pure Earth's surface. And the red is higher, the greens to the blues are lower. Here's the old dam, and that's where it was breached, and this is the old channel. The channel, by the way, is a lot wider than the stream that flows in it now. If we actually had the water of the Monarch River in here, it would be maybe a fifth the width of this. And by the way, these red lines are just cross sections from the next thing we did. So we took that, and then you can start to do things like this nowadays. You can say, I want to put a dam back in where it used to be. Say it's 10 feet tall and had an opening 10 feet wide, if we know this, and there's some descriptions of it, and recreate the flood. And so what the blue area represents now is this is the extent of a single flood from like a 3-acre reservoir that would have been behind that dam in the past. And so this is considerably wider than the modern stream, but it actually fits in the width of the channel that's actually in the landscape. And so one of the things that fisheries biologists are really interested in is when they look at a channel nowadays, they go, does this channel the work of the modern hydrology? Or is it the work of some old hydrology? And in this case, it would be old hydrology that was the product of running these dams. And then you make decisions like, this is a natural system, it is what it is, or this is still not a natural system, how do we want to try to address that? Wood, reintroduce wood, other kinds of structures, whatever. But that's one of the first things that they want to know. So what was it like? One other cool thing was you can also, this is dam modeling software that FEMA uses to project how many people will get killed by a flood if the dam bursts. This is a bigger area, though, that's where the dam was, and what the colors represent is time in minutes for how long the flood took to move down the river channel. And the red lines don't correspond to anything, but the blue color, if I remember right, represented something like an hour and a half. And so there's very old anecdotal descriptions of a few people who worked on these floods that would say, yeah, we floated all day. But then when you actually reconstruct the flood, you realize they could have gone from this dam to this dam in 3 hours, for example. And then you could figure out, well, how long did it take them to fill up the dam again? So how many times in the summer could they run these things? So in a sense, I think one of the cool things is to be able to use modern technology to kind of reconstruct or add to history in some way. Because these guys that were working here didn't think that what they were doing were history in any sense of the word. They're remarkably imperfect records that they kept about how many dams and where. When they were done using them, they just tore them down. There was nothing preserved kind of for posterity's sake. Wow. You might make it. One last thing that was kind of cool. The thing that I passed out is a poem from this guy, and his name's John Ingalls. He was a Pulitzer Prize nominated poet and spent his career at St. Michael's College in Vermont. And one day, doing some Googling, which is very powerful research, I hit on reference to him writing poems about his time in northeast Wisconsin, and he liked to fish. So I found this book, and among other things, he wrote several poems about changing environment in northeast Wisconsin. And the particular one you're looking at is about fishing on the north branch of the Oconto River, which is where I was showing you that work is going on now with the computer-based work. And not too far away, but it talks about the late 1800s, early 1900s. He was born in 1931. So I started to poke around a little bit more and realized that his father and his uncle were born in Green Bay. downtown, on the same street that Red Smith was born on. If you know Red Smith School, ever heard of it? Red Smith was what, a Pulitzer Prize-winning sports writer for the New York Times. He was real famous in Green Bay, long since passed away, but very, very well known. He wrote about lots of different things, baseball, football, all kinds of stuff. So Engel's father and his uncle were born in Green Bay, and they both became writers in some way. His father became an English professor at Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame, and his uncle, who was a big outdoorsman, eventually worked for the Navy, like in their technical writing area. His father, he had a really kind of a strange relationship with. He was a heavy drinker. He writes about it in some of his poetry. His mother died when he was really young, and there were lots of kind of hard feelings about it. Those poems that he wrote, and that one in particular is not him, they were reminiscences of his uncle. When he was a boy in northeast Wisconsin and used to go with his father fishing in northern Wisconsin. And it's literally an environmental history of seeing the old stumps from the logging times, the charred wood from the forest fires that would go through, the newspaper reports of the fish being taken out in large quantity by anglers, and so on and so forth, just in this one particular poem. He didn't write poems like this most of his life. A lot of his stuff is very, very different. The interesting thing about Engels was, when I found out about him was just, 2 years ago. He died in 2007, and remember I said he had a connection to St. Norbert. In the archives, this is him. And there's 2 Norbertines. And this, I think I found out, was Tom Phelan. I think he was a philosophy professor back in the day. Engels' first academic job was teaching in St. Norbert. He taught for 5 years. And he got accepted to the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, which is a famous, prestigious writing conference in Vermont. He went to Vermont, thought Vermont was a lot prettier than northeast Wisconsin, and found a job there and spent the rest of his career there, but still wrote off and on about Wisconsin, and came back apparently periodically and would visit. Not St. Norbert, but would come back and visit northeast Wisconsin. And interesting enough, it's probably the first example, and I'm not a poet, a big poet guy, what I call kind of environmental history in poetry. And there's a number of really interesting poems like that that he put together. That was a really kind of a cool find. And I actually wound up talking to his children. I called his children, they were very nice. His widow, they all live in New England, because obviously that's where he went to Vermont. And they're all very generous in talking about him. And I remember him really fondly, because he was just a wonderful, wonderful guy. It's too bad, but I didn't catch him a few years earlier, but it was still good enough. So that was kind of the last thing I wanted to mention. And say thanks for listening, thanks for coming. I think we made it.
You made it.
6 minutes.
Yeah.
Question?
Can we ask questions?
Yeah.
For-
Well, okay, so I was really interested in what you said. There's a powerful, lot of money behind
Yeah.
the not maybe great way of restoring the trout streams. Is there, so like who's on the other side? Is there a chance the other side could win?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because in general in the state, the DNR basically holds, right, they're a regulatory agency, as well as being, one that does restoration work and so on, and sells fishing licenses. But a lot of trout stream work that they do is funded privately. So what the DNR might say is, we really would like to do work on this section of stream. We think if it's improved, it'll be this much better. And Trout Unlimited will supply the funds, and oftentimes they're volunteers to do it. The real issue becomes if someone says, if Trout Unlimited says, we really want to give you $50,000 to restore this section because we really think it could be better. And then you're on the DNR side going, well, do we just say, we don't need the money right now to do that. It's not a wise project. Or do you say, well, we'll go out and supervise 20 of them to do the work and take, and it is what it is. Things are getting, they're better to some degree, but do you start turning down money knowing that then it might not come back? But they're an extremely powerful group in the state, and especially in the Southwest. But to be fair, they've actually worked pretty well with the DNR. But there are some signs that there's some innovative work going on, and I left those slides out. There's a couple of people at UW-Madison who have gone in and done limited projects where they've taken all that sediment, that 5-10 foot high sediment, and completely taken it out of the floodplain. Basically like a construction project. And then instead of armoring the channel sides, they've reestablished the native vegetation and then looked at and those are projects now that are going to go on for years in terms of monitoring. What's the stream temperatures like? How do those respond? Sedimentation, is it getting worse or better in terms of the spawning gravels? Things like that. But it's that much more expensive because literally what they're doing is if a 10-foot stream's through here, what Trout Unlimited will do is say from the walls to the stream, we're going to take that stuff out and slope it, cover it with rocks and cover it with grass. What some of these other folks are doing are saying, stream's 10 feet wide in here, we're going to go from here halfway out into the quad and scrape all that stuff away and start to put back native prairie vegetation and reconnect the stream with its floodplain, which is much more like it used to be. But the cost difference is enormous. So right now they're just kind of experimental plots in a sense. But that kind of methodology that you saw is kind of the standard in the Southwest. And it's upwards of $10 million a year, I think is what I remember him telling us. That was how much Trout Unlimited was giving him per year to do that work. They were major projects. And the fellow that's now kind of working in the Northeast from the DNR is a young guy, different perspective, and much more kind of modern thinking, geomorphology background, hydrology background, and he's much more concerned about trying to educate first and then use that as a tool to maybe get people to think more differently about that it's okay to have a lot of wood in the river because actually that's really good and that's the way it used to be, even though you might trip and sprain your ankle a few times when you're trying to fish this. It's not as neat, but it's actually, it's a much more natural system to work toward.
If you've been, I know it's in the UP, but if you looked at the Sylvania Wilderness area?
A little bit,
Okay.
yeah. Some of those slides actually were from the UP because there was some work done there later when there were people taking their actual photos.
Right.
There's almost no photography, I mean there's some, but I've yet to find a good photograph of a smaller splash dam in Wisconsin in the Northeast. Only some of the bigger ones that were built like on the Wolf River in particular.
We should talk about Sylvania, because there's a lot of what you're showing, there's
Yeah.
places like that, and then there's places that were unlogged.
And I've got some old reports from the archaeology group at Milwaukee, who years ago did similar kinds of survey work, where the dams were and so on and so forth, specifically to try to provide that information for restoration work in that area. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting work, but things are shifting more northwards. It seems like the Forest Service doesn't have the money and isn't willing to work in the same way as the DNR, and so there's a lot of streams that just have had nothing done to them since forest was allowed to come back. Besides doing things like taking out old dam structures, in a limited area, putting in bigger culverts in these roads to enhance flow, faster flow, kind of limited, isolated things that most people agree are are good to do. Anything else?
Well, my question is related to Amy's, which is that I feel like you could be in a John Grisham novel movie where Julia Roberts is your lawyer and Trout Unlimited has disappeared you. She's gonna represent you. So you present Trout Unlimited as sort of benign, but with this level of money, I really do feel like you could be in a John Grisham movie. So do you, I'm serious when I say, do you ever worry about, or do geologists worry about having their research shut down or being
No.
manipulated? I mean, this is big money.
No, and actually, to be fair, people like that are willing to, the reason that I actually got interested in this in part was the former head of Trout Unlimited said, I've given talks about this stuff to Trout Unlimited groups, but not quite in the same way. I've done it more as kind of, what's the history of the streams that you spend so much time on? And let them try to subliminally figure out that, oh, they used to be like that. Or maybe that's actually more natural than we thought it was. They do a tremendous amount of good work. It's trying to shift. There's kind of this just tug and pull over how to do things. What's the best methodology? But everybody wants kind of the same goal. They want to make streams better for trout, and also with a real concern for how warming climate is going to impact them too. So everybody's in a sense kind of towards the same goal. It's how exactly to get there. That's kind of what's going on. Yeah, but there's no like hidden, like secret murders or anything.
There could be, though.
That you
Or
know.
bodies
That
in
you
trout
know.
streams or stuff. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Great.
Appreciate it.
Oh, it is.